Knapford Station's birthday, and there was going to be a grand party. It was going to be put up on a billboard. The photographer was having trouble fitting all the engines into the photograph. Later that day, Thomas puffed into Marron Station to pick up the new. But when Thomas saw it, he was very disappointed. No one can see me at all. Thomas puffed towards Knapford. Just in time, he hit the buffers and the billboard flew into the lake. Then he saw Diesel. So Thomas didn't tell Diesel. Then he saw Diesel. Diesel was puffing straight to Tidmouth branch line, and he raced back to The engines were very cross. Soon they had all gone, and Diesel trundled straight by. Later, Thomas had gathered the engines again. Then Thomas went to Marron to collect the photographer. Thomas saw Diesel. So Thomas wheeshed lots of steam. It billowed from his boiler and filled the whole station. So Diesel didn't see the photographer, and he trundled straight by. So all the engines came back later, instead of doing their jobs. But just then, Diesel oiled round the bend. He screeched to a halt. Rolls of bunting went everywhere. For the rest of the day, Thomas worked hard. He did all Diesel's jobs. And Diesel picked up the new billboard, just in time for the celebration. The new billboard was the best billboard they'd ever seen. Edward puffed up to the junction for the express line. Thomas was wheezed. Edward didn't take the express line. Edward was having a wonderful time under bridges, but the track ahead led to the school. The track was very bumpy and jumpy. The shiny brass edge of the wheel started to cut into the ropes, but Edward didn't know. At the water wheel cut even deeper through the ropes. And he huffed to himself, "The other engines on the hill will all see my special." It was magnificent, but the water wheel was very heavy. Edward huffed and puffed up the hill. At last, he reached the top. But the edges of the water wheel were cutting deeper and deeper into the ropes. Then there was trouble. With a final jolt, the ropes pulled off Edward's flatbed. Gordon was further down the hill with flatbeds of scrap iron. The water wheel rolled down the hill. It bounced onto Gordon's flatbed. Now Edward's magnificent water wheel was on its way to the smelters. Edward had to get to the smelter's yard before no one saw Edward pass, and no one stopped to wait. Gordon puffed slowly into the smelter's yard. He pulled up outside the smelting shed. Then suddenly, Rosie's Funfair Special. Rosie is a lively little tank engine. She is very quick. She also likes to be very busy. Any job is a good job for Rosie. Rosie puffed sadly along. She wished she could pull a special on her own. So Rosie raced off as fast as her pistons would pump. Rosie puffed alongside the fun. He couldn't see that Emily was already coupled up and waiting for Rosie didn't know that Emily was on the other end of the train. Then there was trouble. Rosie huffed and puffed. She heaved and hauled. The couplings groaned and strained until one of them... But Rosie had left half of it behind with Emily. Then there was trouble. Another coupling snapped. He's tooting at my funfair special, thought Rosie, because the coconut truck was rolling toward the level crossing. It smashed against the gate. Coconuts rolled everywhere. The level crossing was blocked, but Rosie didn't know. She puffed happily on. Then another coupling snapped. Rosie passed Stepney in a side. The points changed. Stepney blew his whistle loudly. He was whistling because the truck of sugar was now rolling towards him. Stepney was covered in pink sugar from funnel to footplate. But Rosie didn't know. She puffed proudly on. Rosie steamed up Gordon's Hill. Another coupling snapped, but it was Emily with the rest of the funfair trucks. Rosie's flatbed was now rolling back. It bashed into Emily. Seats from the big wheel clattered and clanged all over the tracks. Rosie chuffed cheerfully into Maithwaite Station. First, Rosie collected Rocky. Then she pulled them as quickly as she could. She picked up the coconut truck. Then Rosie collected a new truck of sugar, and she raced back to Emily. Rocky had just loaded the seats back onto the flatbed, and together they set off up Gordon's Hill. Rosie and Emily arrived at Maithwaite. Mountain Marvel. The narrow-gauge engines in the hills of Sodor always want to hear stories. Their favourite ones are about a magical engine called... Peter Sam huffed and puffed to the top of the old twisty track. He saw a thick hedge across the track. Peter Sam crashed through the hedge. With a clang and a prang, he hit some. There, in front of Peter Sam, was a statue of Proteus. It was sitting on a rusty old He stopped at the junction. The farm workers had covered the statue of Proteus. Peter Sam pumped his pistons. The cream churns were heavy, but Proteus' statue was even heavier. Sam raced down the hill. Peter Sam smashed into a buffer. The cream churns crashed. The junction was blocked. They were surprised at the mess. He chuffed towards Brendam Docks. At a junction, Henry decided to take the track that passed the wishing tree. Some leaves were gone and some branches were broken. Henry took the track to Brendam. His boiler bubbled and his steam sighed. He buffered up to Toby's truck. He pumped his pistons. He had a long line of empty trucks to take to the quarry. So Henry reversed onto Thomas's track, and he slowly wheeshed away. Then Henry saw Percy at a water tower. Percy had to take truckloads of empty milk churns to the farm. Percy shunted his trucks onto the main line. Henry buffered up to Percy's trucks and whooshed away. She had empty trucks to take to the coaling plant, so Emily shunted her train onto the main line. And Henry coupled up. He chuffed happily away. Henry had the longest line of trucks a big engine could pull. At last, Henry puffed to the Wishing Tree Junction. He left Emily and Percy's trucks on one track. Then he shunted Thomas's trucks onto another. All the lines to the Wishing Tree were blocked. First, Henry took Toby's trucks to the depot. Then he took Thomas's trucks to the quarry. Next, he took Emily's trucks to the coaling plant. Finally, he took Percy's trucks of empty milk churns to the farm. Soon, Henry chuffed up to the Wishing Tree. Must take new machines from the docks to the factory. Thomas buffered up to the machine trucks. Thomas hadn't the puff to whistle hello. Thomas huffed and he puffed. His wheels spun and spun. Hank had lots of steam, and Hank blew the longest and loudest whistle. The spring morning, Toby chuffed cheerfully into Titmuth's sheds. Toby watched his friends steam off to their special. Toby steamed into the hills. Toby saw a big red bird in a very tall tree. Toby puffed closer. No bird. It was an old Wellington boot. Toby steamed deeper into the hills and away from Great Waterton. Toby could see something glistening and glittering in the afternoon sun. Toby puffed closer. Now he could see it wasn't a treasure chest at all. It was a rusty truck of old tin cow. He was late, so Toby steamed quickly away, and they puffed quickly away. Toby knew he had to hurry to get to Great Waterton. Then Toby saw something bright shining beside the track. It wasn't something special. It was an old piece of metal stuck in the bushes. On the other side of the metal was a picture of a steam tram. It looked just like Toby. At last, Emily chuffed out of the flood. But now, Emily chuffed up to the fallen tree. Emily pushed as hard as she could. But the tree didn't roll out of the way. It stayed in front of Emily. Now Emily had to push the tree up a hill. It was very hard work, and Emily was getting later and later. At last, Emily came to the top of the hill. The tree rolled away, and Emily raced down the other side. She rattled through the valleys. Emily steamed round the final bend and straight into a big puddle of mud. Emily blew her whistle as loud as she could. Emily pumped her pistons. Then she stopped. Emily saw a telegraph pole across the track in front of her. She was going to push it out. Soon Harvey cleared the track and Emily was on her way again. A shortcut to the airport. So Freddie didn't chuff after Mr. Percival. He raced after Peter Sam instead. And Freddie still hadn't asked Mr. Percival if they could have the party at the wharf. The flatbeds were still waiting to be unloaded. Freddie raced to catch up with the barge. Freddie steamed back to Colin. He told Colin all about the party. Up ahead, Thomas saw a water tower through the trees. The water tower was starting to duck was right next to it, but as the water tower crashed to the ground. It had fallen onto the tracks. The signalman changed the points. Just then, Harvey raced towards the junction. He changed tracks and puffed down the other line. Harvey was surprised. Thomas chuffed on to collect the firemen. Then, Thomas saw Toby. Smoke and steam billowed from Toby's ass. So Thomas puffed quickly back to the points. He changed over, buffered up behind Toby and Thomas shunted Toby off the express line and into a siding. Gordon chuffed past. Just then, Percy puffed up. So Percy raced away. Thomas collected the engineer from Gordon. Then Thomas found Harvey. He took Harvey to move the fallen. Thomas puffed sadly back to Tidmouth. And Thomas puffed away. Duncan and a hot air balloon. It was a beautiful day in the hills of Surrey. His special birthday flag had been fixed to his... On his way, Duncan rolled over a bumpy track. His flatbed clanked, rattled and jiggled. One of the ropes holding down the balloon came undone. So Duncan began to jiggle backwards and forwards over the bumpy track. The ropes loosened and the balloon floated away. Duncan puffed round a bend. The balloon had floated down. It was right in front of him on the basket wobbled and one of the sandbags fell off. It made the balloon rise up a little. He biffed the balloon again. More sandbags fell off and higher and floated away. Duncan chuffed round another bend. There, on the bridge above him, was the balloon. Duncan chuffed his biggest puff. The hot smoke from his funnel flew into the balloon. It made the balloon get bigger. And puffed and huffed, the balloon got bigger and bigger and floated away, straight towards the weather vane on the thin controller's roof. It burst on the sharp pointer. The balloon tumbled down. Balloon repairman looked at Duncan's flag. James works it out. And to show other engines he knows best too. It was winter on the island of Sodor. Thomas, Stanley and James were working at the yards. They were shunting trains to take to Great Waterton. They had to arrive on time. James collected Hector. Stanley watched as James shunted Hector to the back of his train. Snow started to fall. So James buffered up to his train and steamed slowly out of the yards. James puffed through the countryside. The snow was getting heavier. James stopped at a signal. James arrived at the Shen Valley Junction. Now the snow was very thick. It made it hard for James to see ahead. James puffed on to the wrong track. James thought he was steaming through Shen Valley, but he wasn't. He was steaming towards the snowy hills. James saw Edward in a siding. So James puffed slowly towards the hill. James huffed and puffed. He steamed and strained. James arrived at the top of the hill. Then there was trouble. Hector could see a snowslide had blocked the line. James applied his brakes. The train smashed straight into the snow. At last, he had hauled Hector back to the top of the hill. James raced faster and faster down the hill. There was a mighty biff, and Hector pushed the train right through the snow. We did it! Well done, Hector! Flora and Thomas waited at the junction to Toby's shed. It looked empty. Flora pumped her pistons perkily. Suddenly, Thomas saw steam coming from Toby. That made Flora very happy. Toby, Toby, please have gone. Lead the show, be proud and strong, Thomas puffed to himself. This time, Thomas was sure Toby's shed was empty. And they puffed quickly away. Flora's axles ached. Thomas and Flora puffed up to the junction. Then there was trouble. Flora had chuffed too far. She had run out of coal. He could see Stanley ahead. So Gordon took the other track. Gordon steamed further along his shortcut. Gordon puffed around a bend. Ahead, there was a bridge. Under the bridge, it wasn't Great Waterton. Gordon steamed along. Then he saw another bridge. But under the bridge, it wasn't Great Waterton. It was the shunting yard of a logging Stanley's whistle from the track below. Gordon pumped his pistons. Then there was trouble. Ben was shunting a flatbed of logs. Gordon biffed straight into them. The logs started to roll down the hill. But Gordon didn't know which track to take. Soon the track was clear, and Gordon steamed away. He had to warn Stanley. Then Gordon arrived at a fork in the track. Gordon saw Oliver and Toad puffing toward him, and Gordon raced on. Gordon arrived at another fork in the track. He didn't know which way to go. Then he saw Duck chuffing over a bridge. Duck was happy to help, and Gordon steamed off. At last, Gordon puffed on to the lower track. He could see the logs had fallen across Stanley's line. Then he saw Stanley chuffing round the bend. Thomas was determined to win. Thomas and Diesel took separate tracks to the hopper. Thomas steamed towards the hopper. Thomas bashed into Diesel. Stone poured down from the hopper. Thomas was covered from funnel to footplate in dust. Thomas and Diesel raced buffer to buffer. But Thomas couldn't see Mavis. He raced backwards into... Thomas pumped his pistons. Thomas steamed into the lead. Had to win this race, but Diesel rattled along towards Harry and Bert. With a crash and a bash, Thomas and Diesel smashed Harry and Bert right through the back of the engine sheds. Stones and timber flew everywhere. And Thomas chuffed quickly away. Thomas shunted the trucks under the hopper. Soon they were all filled. Then Thomas collected Rocky. Next, Thomas shunted Rocky over to the sheds. At last, all the trucks were loaded with broken rubble from the sheds. So together, Thomas and Diesel shunted the trucks as quickly as they could. He chuffed to himself. Thomas puffed proudly into the... They puffed quickly away. There, all in white, was a man. He was carved into the hillside. He shone in the moon. The Sodor River Bridge was being rebuilt. They were made especially for the bridge. Thomas had to stop at a signal. Thomas applied his brake, and his brakes wouldn't work properly. He raced round the bend, much too far. Blocks bounced off his flatbed. But Thomas arrived at the top of a steep hill. Thomas applied his brakes, but they still weren't working properly, and the squeak. Thomas couldn't slow down. He raced into an emergency siding, and he hit the buffers with a big bump. More of the special blocks bounced off his flatbed down a steep bank. Now there was only one stack left. Thomas set off once more, very slowly, for the bridge. Finally, Thomas saw the Sodor River Bridge ahead. Thomas's brakes had stopped working. His flatbed bashed his buffers with a bump. The last of the special blocks fell from his flatbed into the wall. It had made the last blocks fall from his flatbed. Thomas remembered where he had hit the buffers. Bumpy track. Soon Stanley was chuffing along. He shunted Thomas behind him. And Murdoch shunted Rocky. They reached the bottom of the steep hill. Hooray! There they are! Soon, Rocky had lifted the blocks onto Stanley's flatbed, and they all puffed on. And he set off proudly with the special blocks. Later that day, Thomas chuffed back to the Sodor River Bridge. Thomas was bringing the banners and bunting, and Percy was bringing gravel for the pathways. Percy pushed and pushed, but the trucks wouldn't move, long and loudly. Percy had collected the carriage. He had to meet Lady Hat at Maithwaite Station. It was a long way from Great Waterton. To tell Lady Hat, so Percy puffed away. Percy couldn't see Lady Hat anywhere. Percy blew his whistle long and loudly. Percy steamed back to Great Waterton as fast as he could. Skarloey heaved and hauled up the steep hill. He pulled with all their strength and steam. First, the trucks trundled one way, then they trundled the other. Skarloey was determined to win. Then Rheneas heard a creaking and a cranking. He knew the couplings were being pulled too hard. Snap, bashed and bumped into Skarloey and pushed him down the other side of the hill. He tried to apply his brakes, but they wouldn't work. Skarloey flew fast, but it was too late. Skarloey crashed into Duncan's trucks. Bunting flew into the air. It clattered and chattered. Then Skarloey saw Rusty at a junction ahead. Rusty was pulling trucks of special ice cream to cross the tracks. Skarloey bashed into Rusty's trucks. Ice cream flew into the air, so Skarloey clattered on. Skarloey went round the bend too fast. Skarloey bashed through the buffers. With a splash, a sploosh and a splosh, Skarloey plunged into Percival Pond. Scream or flags, and they won't have their puppet show. Slowly Rheneas heaved and hauled his friend, and his coal was wet. And Rheneas puffed proudly away with the puppet show special. Best friends. Thomas and Percy are best friends. They tell each other everything. They even have a best friend's whistle. Thomas still didn't know how to tell Percy about the... Percy puffed past. He didn't see Tom. Then Thomas saw Percy again. So he took a different track to the docks. Thomas knew it would take him longer. There's Percy again. He was sure Percy was going to see him. Percy puffed past. He didn't see Thomas hiding behind Duck's long line as fast as his pistons would pump. Now Thomas really wanted to find Percy, but Percy was nowhere to be found. Waiting. Thomas buffered up to Percy's mail trucks and quickly pulled away.